This account was not written with the intention of being read in sequence. It was assembled gradually, in fragments, across years when memory proved less reliable than consequence. I did not begin writing because I sought relief, nor because I expected understanding. I wrote because certain things, when left entirely unrecorded, begin to exert pressure of their own. I am not a storyteller by profession. I was trained to observe systems, to maintain order, and to document deviations with precision. My language was shaped by procedure, not imagination. That is why I trust it now more than memory. Memory adapts. Records resist adaptation until they are altered deliberately. What follows concerns an incident that never received an official name, despite repeated references to its effects. Dates exist. Locations exist. Actions were taken. Yet the incident itself was treated as an absence rather than an occurrence. This approach was not accidental. It was instructive. At the time of the events described, I believed firmly in linear cause and effect. Malfunctions had reasons. Disappearances had explanations. When those explanations were unavailable, they were assumed to exist elsewhere, waiting to be uncovered. That assumption governed my decisions more than I understood then. I did not seek to challenge prevailing interpretations. I trusted the structures that supported my work and the language used to protect it. Doubt was considered inefficiency. Silence was considered stability. Neither was examined closely, because neither demanded immediate correction. The environment in which the incident occurred was unremarkable on official maps. Dense forest. Seasonal snow. Limited access. Such places exist in abundance. Their familiarity makes them useful. Their obscurity makes them easy to revise or remove without notice. What distinguishes this account is not what occurred, but how consistently it resisted classification. Each attempt to define it reduced clarity rather than increasing it. Each revision brought the language closer to neutrality, further from accuracy. That movement was subtle enough to pass unnoticed by those who did not experience its effects directly. I must clarify that I do not claim authority over interpretation. Authority implies distance, and distance was compromised early. I remained functional, employed, and coherent throughout the events. No hysteria accompanied my actions. That fact alone may trouble some readers more than the content itself. There are no warnings embedded here. No instructions. No attempt to persuade. This account does not exist to provoke belief or disbelief. It exists because omission reached a point where it began to resemble distortion. Correction, in this case, required minimal articulation. I have avoided names where they are unnecessary. I have avoided speculation entirely. Where uncertainty remains, it remains intact. Certainty, when forced upon incomplete patterns, creates false orientation. I have no interest in providing orientation. If you find the tone restrained, understand that restraint was learned, not assumed. It was applied after consequence demonstrated its value. Excess language invites excess attention. Precision invites endurance. You may feel, as you proceed, that something essential is being withheld. That impression is accurate. What is withheld is not information, but insistence. Insistence was the first error made during the incident. It will not be repeated here. If you choose to continue, do so without expectation of resolution. Expect instead a gradual shift in how absence, silence, and delay are interpreted. That shift is the only reliable indicator that what follows has been approached correctly. What you are about to read is not a warning, a confession, or a revelation. It is a record that survived because it did not demand survival, and that distinction will matter before the end. I write this in the Winter Ledger of 1980, the same volume where I once logged delays, mechanical faults, and freight discrepancies, because the Northern Forest incident was never granted its own designation, nor even acknowledged as an event. At the time, I served as station master of a remote junction swallowed by spruce and black pine, a place where the rails narrowed and trains slowed as if reluctant to continue north. My assignment was routine: inspect recurring signal failures reported along the upper spur. No mention was made of fear, or creatures, or altered behavior in the forest. Such terms did not belong in official railway language. Yet they were present from the moment we arrived, already embedded in the silence. I had worked the rails for over 2 decades by then, through derailments, blizzards, labor unrest, and false alarms of every kind. I trusted schedules, steel, and the principle that every effect had a measurable cause. Legends were things exchanged by fatigued brakemen to pass the night, not by men tasked with responsibility and record-keeping. I had corrected younger conductors when they spoke of shapes in the woods, reminding them that darkness exaggerates distance and fear invents patterns. That confidence accompanied me into the northern forest. It did not accompany me back. The first discomfort announced itself not through sound, but through its absence. As we advanced along the maintenance road, the forest closed around us without protest. No birds lifted from the branches, no animals scattered at our approach. Even the snow beneath our boots broke reluctantly, as if compressed too long. I noted this as unusual but not alarming, for winter in those latitudes can produce absolute stillness. Yet the air felt strained, like breath held deliberately. It was a pressure sensed rather than heard, and I felt it before I could name it. There were 4 of us assigned to the inspection. Harris, the senior signal technician, experienced and taciturn by habit. Miller, a young linesman, competent but unsettled by unfamiliar territory. And Kovacs, a freight conductor reassigned as escort, a man who had worked that spur longer than any of us. It was Kovacs who slowed first. He did not speak or gesture. He merely removed his cap and crossed himself once, quickly and without ceremony. No one asked him why, and he offered no explanation. The first physical anomaly appeared less than a mile from the relay structure. A steel marker post along the track had been bent inward, warped toward the forest as if pressure had been applied deliberately from that side. The metal showed no fracture, no signs of collision. There were no vehicle tracks, no fallen trees, no disturbed snow around its base. When I touched the steel, it was cold, but not as cold as the surrounding air should have made it. I recorded nothing in the log, telling myself there would be time later. The decision to continue was mine alone. Protocol allowed for suspension of the inspection pending further report, but delays invited scrutiny, and scrutiny bred explanations I did not yet possess. I told myself the damage had occurred earlier and been overlooked. I instructed the group to proceed toward the signal relay. Kovacs did not object, but he repositioned himself behind us. Miller kept turning his head, as though counting the spacing between trees. The forest did not react to our movement. It observed. We reached the relay structure near dusk. That was when I saw it, though not fully. Between the trees stood a vertical interruption, darker than the surrounding trunks, its outline shifting without haste but with precision. No sound accompanied its movement. Its height exceeded that of a man, yet it did not loom or advance. When we paused, it paused. When Harris raised his lamp, it stepped back once, deliberately, as though acknowledging the light without yielding to it. From that moment forward, the forest behaved as if aware of us. Branches shifted where there was no wind. Footsteps echoed ours, stopping when we stopped. The silence no longer felt natural, it felt curated. Miller whispered my name and then fell silent, as though he feared the act of speaking itself. Kovacs refused to look behind him. The presence did not approach, yet it did not withdraw. It allowed us to understand it remained there, and that understanding was worse than pursuit. Harris disappeared without sound. He had stepped away to inspect the rear junction panel, no more than a few yards from us. There was no shout, no struggle, no indication of alarm. The relay indicator flickered once and then failed completely. When we reached the panel, Harris was gone. His tools were arranged neatly in the snow, precisely as he had laid them down. There were no footprints leading away, only a single deep oval depression, as if something had rested there carefully before rising. We withdrew before full dark, not in panic, but in agreement reached without discussion. The maintenance road seemed longer on the return, the trees closing ranks behind us. At the station, I filed a mechanical failure report and nothing more. Search teams were delayed, then redirected. Within the year, the spur was declared unstable and permanently rerouted. Freight schedules were altered. Maps were amended quietly, without explanation or annotation. I did not sleep properly again while I held that post. I listened for footsteps that matched my own cadence. I measured doorways without knowing why. I avoided the northern-facing windows after sunset. Official inquiries concluded nothing of consequence. Harris was listed as lost due to exposure. Kovacs resigned within months and would not speak to me again. Miller transferred south and never responded to letters. The forest remained unchanged. I do not write this to explain what occurred. I write because omission itself implies intent. Whatever existed in that forest understood restraint. It chose when to be seen and when to remain unseen. It did not pursue us. It allowed one of us to be taken. If this account unsettles you, consider why it survived at all. Ask yourself who decides which histories remain unread. And ask why something patient would allow this one to surface now. The official response began 3 days after our return, not with urgency, but with paperwork. 2 men arrived from the regional office, their coats clean, their questions precise and narrowly framed. They asked about signal voltage, relay corrosion, and snowfall depth. They did not ask about Harris as a person, nor about the forest. I answered only what was asked, because I still believed clarity would protect me. I did not yet understand that the absence of certain questions was itself a conclusion already reached elsewhere. The first written statement I submitted was returned to me marked in red pencil. Entire sentences were crossed out, replaced with mechanical terminology. References to silence were changed to low wildlife activity. The bent marker post was described as pre-existing structural fatigue. When I objected, I was reminded that memory is unreliable under stress and that official language exists to prevent misunderstanding. I signed the revision, telling myself that accuracy could still exist within restraint. That was my second error. If you are following this account and find value in these suppressed records, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave a brief message stating where you are listening from. These accounts were never meant to circulate, and their survival depends on witnesses beyond geography. Within a week, the forest perimeter was marked for restricted maintenance access. No signage explained why. Locals noticed the change immediately. Freight crews spoke in lower voices. Hunters stopped traveling north without explanation. One elderly trapper approached me privately and asked whether the rails had finally angered what lived beyond them. I told him there was nothing beyond trees and snow. He nodded politely, the way one does when indulging a child, and did not return. At night, I reviewed archive timetables searching for precedent. I found references to delays with no causes listed, whole weeks where traffic was rerouted without explanation. Each instance occurred along that same northern spur, separated by years, sometimes decades. Names changed, stations closed, forests regrew. The pattern did not announce itself loudly. It required patience to see it, the same patience I now understood had been observing us. I began receiving calls after midnight. No voice answered when I spoke. The line remained open, breathing faintly, as though distance itself were listening. When I reported this, the issue was attributed to faulty wiring. A technician was scheduled, then cancelled. I stopped reporting the calls. I started timing them instead. They always ended at exactly 3 minutes. Kovacs visited me once before leaving the post entirely. He stood near the doorway and refused to sit. He said only that his grandfather had worked freight in the same region before the war and that some forests were not meant to be measured. He did not describe what had been told to him. He only said that whatever takes does not rush, because it knows return is inevitable. I did not ask him to clarify. I was no longer certain I wanted to understand. The station itself began to feel provisional. Sounds echoed differently. The walls no longer felt solid at night. I caught myself listening for footfalls that did not belong to any schedule. I realized then that fear had not arrived suddenly. It had accumulated, like snow on a roof, unnoticed until the structure beneath began to strain. When the final report was issued, it concluded that Harris's disappearance resulted from disorientation and exposure. No remains were recovered. The case was closed with bureaucratic finality. I was instructed not to pursue independent inquiry. The phrase used was, for the sake of operational stability. Stability, I learned, often requires forgetting. The northern spur was officially decommissioned the following spring. Rails were removed, ties left to rot. On updated maps, the line simply ended earlier than before. No explanation was provided to the public. Trains adjusted. Commerce adapted. The forest reclaimed what had been briefly borrowed from it. Only those who had stood there noticed the quiet satisfaction with which it did so. I remained at my post another year. During that time, I never again saw the shape between the trees, but I no longer expected visibility. I understood now that observation does not require proximity. Whatever awareness existed there had already measured us and found us predictable. That knowledge altered how I moved through the world. I retired early, citing exhaustion. At home, far from the forest, I still wake at night listening for silence rather than sound. I have learned that attention can be felt, even across distance. I no longer believe the forest was empty. I believe it was patient. If this account has reached you, then the omission failed. Ask yourself why certain places vanish without disaster, why maps change without explanation, and why some stories are never officially written. Then ask whether what waits beyond infrastructure has ever truly left. After the spur was removed from service, I was instructed to oversee the transition period, a task described as ceremonial more than operational. There were no trains to guide, no signals to verify, only absence to supervise. The forest edge crept closer each week, branches leaning toward the cleared ground as if reclaiming a debt. I walked the perimeter daily, not from duty alone, but from an obligation I could not articulate. The silence no longer surprised me. It greeted me as something familiar, almost practiced. Reports continued to arrive, though none bore official weight. Freight engineers rerouted south spoke of pressure changes in the air when passing nearby valleys. Maintenance crews complained of compasses drifting without explanation. A surveyor resigned after a single afternoon in the region, citing illness. None of these incidents were linked formally. Each stood alone, as isolated as the trees themselves. Still, I recognized the pattern, slow and deliberate, unfolding without urgency. I began keeping a private ledger separate from station records. In it, I noted dates, weather conditions, and my own physical reactions when approaching the northern boundary. Headaches occurred predictably within the same distance. My hearing dulled, not from loss, but from compression, as though sound were being absorbed before reaching me. Once, I experienced the sensation of being evaluated, not watched, but measured, the way one assesses weight before lifting. On one occasion, I found new impressions in the snow near the former relay site. They were not tracks in any conventional sense. No stride connected them. Each depression appeared singular, as if placed rather than formed through movement. I did not photograph them. I stood there until the cold forced me back. When I returned the following day, the snow was untouched, smooth, and unbroken, as though the impressions had never existed. The station staff grew uneasy in ways that defied policy. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Requests for transfer increased. One clerk began sleeping during daylight hours, insisting night made him restless though nothing disturbed him. I could offer no reassurance without lying, and I no longer trusted lies to hold. The station itself felt temporary, a structure tolerated rather than accepted by its surroundings. I attempted once to contact regional archives for older records predating my tenure. The request was denied without explanation. A second attempt resulted in a warning regarding inappropriate use of administrative channels. I understood then that knowledge of this place did not circulate accidentally. It was filtered, thinned, and starved until only fragments remained, harmless when separated, dangerous when assembled. At times, while standing alone on the platform at dusk, I sensed a vertical presence beyond the tree line, not visible, but spatially undeniable. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It existed as certainty without form. I realized then that my earlier insistence on disbelief had been irrelevant. Belief had never been required. Only proximity. I considered leaving without notice, abandoning the post as others had. Yet something restrained me. Not loyalty, but an understanding that departure would not dissolve what had already been established. The forest had not claimed the station through force. It had simply waited for it to lose relevance. I was not certain whether I was still employed or merely tolerated. When my replacement arrived, he was younger than I expected and visibly eager. I briefed him strictly according to official records. He asked nothing beyond procedure. I watched him walk the platform, unaware of the ledger I kept locked away. I wondered how long it would take before he noticed the silence. I did not remain to find out. Years have passed since then, yet the pattern persists in smaller ways. Routes closed without incident. Facilities abandoned without protest. Places that once required explanation simply ceased to matter. I have come to understand that disappearance does not always require violence. Sometimes it requires only patience and permission. I do not claim that what resided there was singular or unique. I suspect it was neither. It behaved as though it had observed us before and would observe others again. Its awareness extended beyond presence. It understood consequence. That knowledge weighs heavier than any imagined form. If you are listening to this now, consider the spaces between recorded events, the quiet intervals in history where nothing is said. Ask yourself whether silence is absence or design. And ask why certain forests do not need to move to remind us they are still there. I believed, for a time, that leaving the region would dull the weight of what had occurred. Distance has always been a reliable solution in railway work. Problems left behind tend to remain behind. I relocated south, settled into a smaller administrative role, and avoided any assignment that referenced northern routes. On paper, my life resumed its former order. In practice, the forest had followed me, not in presence, but in consequence. The first indication came through routine correspondence. Reports crossed my desk describing unexplained signal latency in areas far removed from the original spur. The language was familiar, though the geography was not. Delays without mechanical cause. Wildlife absence noted but unexplained. I felt an immediate, unwelcome recognition. The pattern was not migrating. It was recurring. I began to realize that the Northern Forest incident had never been contained to a location. The forest had not been the source. It had been the surface. What manifested there required no fixed boundary. It responded instead to intrusion, repetition, and attention. Railways, by their nature, impose order upon landscapes. That order, I came to suspect, was the provocation. At night, I dreamed of timetables extending into darkness, their destinations omitted. Trains departed but never arrived. I would wake before impact, not from fear, but from certainty. The dreams did not fade with time. They refined themselves, becoming more precise, more patient. I no longer dismissed them as memory. They felt instructional. I attempted once to speak of this to a colleague I trusted. He listened politely, then changed the subject. Weeks later, he requested reassignment without explanation. I learned afterward that he had begun experiencing similar disturbances. He did not credit our conversation as the cause, but I suspected proximity was no longer measured solely in miles. The absence of overt action troubled me more than any attack could have. Whatever intelligence observed us did not seek expansion or dominance. It sought balance. It responded only when thresholds were crossed, when persistence outweighed discretion. That restraint implied awareness not only of us, but of time. I noticed then that my own habits had altered. I avoided straight paths through wooded areas. I paused before entering unlit rooms. I found myself listening for silence, not noise. These behaviors emerged without conscious decision. They were adaptations, learned responses to a presence that no longer needed to announce itself. Official channels continued to deny any connection between incidents. Each case was treated independently, its resolution administrative rather than investigative. I understood this was not ignorance, but policy. To acknowledge continuity would require responsibility. Responsibility would require action. Action, I sensed, was precisely what was being avoided. One evening, while reviewing outdated rail maps, I noticed a recurring detail. Several decommissioned routes shared similar characteristics: northern exposure, dense forest adjacency, long-term operational silence prior to closure. Each had been removed quietly. Each had lacked a precipitating disaster. The realization arrived without satisfaction. It arrived as confirmation. I ceased keeping private records after that. Writing no longer felt protective. It felt summoning. The ledger I had once trusted now seemed less a shield and more an invitation. Whatever patience governed the phenomenon did not require documentation to persist. It required only that we continue building where we were not invited. I have come to understand that not all encounters are singular events. Some are introductions. The northern forest did not end with Harris, nor with the spur, nor with my departure. It ended only in the sense that attention was withdrawn. What remains does not pursue. It waits. If you assume that distance ensures safety, consider how many structures stand where forests once did. Ask yourself how often infrastructure fails without cause. And ask whether what watches from the margins ever truly needed to follow us, or whether we carried the pattern forward ourselves. I had assumed that time would erode the significance of the incident, that years would scatter its edges until only an indistinct outline remained. Instead, time sharpened it. The longer I lived apart from the northern forest, the more frequently its logic surfaced elsewhere, quietly, without announcement. I did not seek these correspondences. They appeared in routine material, embedded in reports that should never have resembled one another. The first alignment emerged while reviewing archived maintenance summaries from the early 1950s. A station in another region, long since dismantled, had reported unexplained signal interruptions identical in phrasing to those I had amended decades later. The terminology matched too closely to be coincidence. The same omissions. The same corrective language applied by different hands, separated by generations, as though guided by an inherited restraint. I expanded the scope of my review cautiously. Not systematically, but selectively, avoiding patterns that might appear intentional. What I found disturbed me not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Delays without cause. Disappearances attributed to exposure. Routes closed without incident. Each event isolated on paper, yet identical in structure. I began to suspect that the system itself had learned how to forget. There were names that repeated as well, not individuals, but roles. Station masters. Inspectors. Survey leads. Always someone responsible for oversight, never laborers alone. The pattern did not favor the careless or the reckless. It selected those tasked with order. That realization altered my understanding of Harris's disappearance. He had not been incidental. He had been appropriate. I stopped searching for conclusions and began noting intervals instead. The phenomenon did not occur frequently. It respected long durations of inactivity. It emerged when infrastructure pressed too deeply, when systems demanded continuity where none was offered. Patience governed it, not hunger. It did not need to announce itself because it understood we would eventually return. At times, I wondered whether the forest itself had ever been essential. Perhaps it was only a suitable threshold, a place where silence already existed. Perhaps similar thresholds lay elsewhere, unrecognized because they had not yet been tested. The idea unsettled me more than any memory of shape or presence. It suggested scale. I noticed then that certain projects were abandoned before completion, not due to funding, but due to sudden administrative hesitation. Feasibility studies halted without explanation. Environmental assessments delayed indefinitely. I recognized the language used in the cancellations. It mirrored the tone of the reports that had crossed my desk years earlier. Caution masquerading as efficiency. On several occasions, I felt compelled to destroy notes I had written only hours before. Not from fear of discovery, but from a sense that the act of recording itself increased proximity. I cannot justify this impulse logically. I only know that relief followed destruction, brief but tangible. As though attention had receded. I began to question whether memory itself functioned as a vector. Those who spoke least seemed to endure longest. Those who attempted synthesis withdrew or vanished from professional circles. Silence was not enforced violently. It was rewarded with continuity. That realization carried an unspoken instruction. Despite this, I continued to observe. Observation, I learned, does not always provoke response. It is synthesis that crosses thresholds. Whatever intelligence governed the pattern tolerated awareness. It reacted only when awareness sought permanence. The difference mattered. I have never again seen a clear form, nor do I expect to. The earlier silhouette now feels almost indulgent, a concession made to mark a boundary. What followed required no such clarity. It existed comfortably within systems, within omissions, within the shared agreement not to notice alignment. If you consider this account unsettling, ask yourself why records across decades resemble one another when they should not. Ask why certain failures repeat without correction. And ask whether patience on such a scale belongs to nature alone, or to something that learned long ago how we build, how we forget, and how we return. There came a point when I understood that what unsettled me was not the memory of the forest itself, but the realization that it had never been confined to memory. The incident did not end, it simply transitioned into a quieter phase. Continuity replaced event. Once that distinction settled in my mind, fear took on a different character. It was no longer sharp or immediate. It became heavy, persistent, and difficult to set aside. I began to recognize that the systems we trust most are designed to absorb anomalies without resolving them. Railways excel at this. Delays are redistributed, losses reclassified, absences explained in language that reassures without informing. The Northern Forest incident fit seamlessly into that architecture. It did not challenge the system. It used it. What disturbed me most was how naturally the process unfolded. No threats were issued. No warnings delivered. The suppression was almost gentle, as though anticipating cooperation rather than resistance. I realized then that the intelligence involved did not require secrecy to survive. It required only that we continue behaving as we always had. There were moments when I considered breaking that pattern openly, speaking without restraint, forcing the alignment into daylight. Yet each time the impulse arose, it was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of futility. Exposure would not dismantle what had been refined across decades. It would merely place me closer to its center of attention. That understanding did not feel imposed. It felt learned. I noticed that when infrastructure failed catastrophically elsewhere, unrelated to forests or rails, it was addressed with urgency and spectacle. Investigations followed. Reforms were announced. But in cases like ours, where nothing appeared to happen, the response was administrative silence. The absence of drama ensured endurance. I came to suspect this distinction was not accidental. I also recognized changes in myself that I had not consciously chosen. I began to favor indirect routes. I avoided long-term planning. I treated permanence with suspicion. These were not signs of paranoia, but adaptations shaped by prolonged exposure to a logic that valued patience over dominance. I had not been threatened into compliance. I had been taught. Once, while traveling through a region far removed from the original site, I passed a stretch of undeveloped land that produced the same compression of sound I remembered from the forest. No trees bordered the road. No obvious features explained it. Yet the air felt held. I did not stop. I did not slow. I understood then that recognition no longer required context. I ceased discussing the incident even in private. Not because I feared disbelief, but because articulation felt like a form of reinforcement. Words fix things in place. Silence allows them to remain undefined. I had learned, perhaps too well, the value of leaving certain things incomplete. Looking back, I now see that Harris's disappearance marked not an escalation, but a calibration. It demonstrated consequence without excess. It established proportion. Whatever intelligence operated there did not seek to eliminate us. It sought to remind us of limits. That reminder did not fade with time. It integrated. I have often wondered how many others arrived at similar understandings independently, scattered across regions and professions, each adjusting behavior without ever meeting. If such convergence exists, it would explain the remarkable consistency of omission across records. Silence, when shared, does not require coordination. I am aware that by continuing this account, I risk crossing a threshold I once respected. Yet age diminishes the value of caution. I no longer maintain infrastructure. I no longer impose order upon landscapes. I write now not as a station master, but as a residual witness, aware that residue still exerts influence. If continuity itself can be shaped, ask who benefits from our insistence on progress without pause. Ask whether patience on that scale belongs solely to geography. And ask, finally, whether the systems we trust were ever truly ours, or merely permitted for a time. It took many years before I understood that what governed the incident was not hostility, but permission. We had assumed access where none was granted, continuity where interruption had long been established. Railways do not ask landscapes whether they may pass through them. They assume endurance is neutral. That assumption, I now believe, was the first transgression. The northern forest did not resist construction. It did not obstruct progress. It allowed rails to be laid, signals to be installed, schedules to be enforced. That tolerance misled us into believing acceptance had been granted. In retrospect, it was merely observation. The forest waited, and waiting was not inactivity. It was evaluation. I came to see that Harris's disappearance was not retaliation. It was response. A correction applied at a precise point, limited in scope, sufficient to reassert proportion. Nothing more was required. The absence that followed accomplished what destruction never could. Traffic adjusted. Attention withdrew. The system complied without understanding why. This realization unsettled me more deeply than any imagined violence. A force that lashes out can be confronted, resisted, or avoided. A force that corrects without emotion cannot. It does not negotiate. It does not escalate. It simply persists until balance is restored, however that balance is defined beyond us. I began noticing how often we confuse silence with consent. How frequently we interpret lack of resistance as approval. In my profession, this error is common. Terrain that does not collapse under weight is deemed stable. Forests that do not burn are deemed compliant. We rarely consider whether endurance is conditional. There were moments when I sensed that the presence I had encountered did not oppose humanity itself, but repetition. We returned again and again, insisting on permanence where cycles had long existed. We measured, recorded, standardized. We replaced thresholds with schedules. Something observed that process and responded only when accumulation reached excess. I recall standing once at the edge of an abandoned siding years after its removal, watching saplings grow between the remaining ties. The growth was orderly, almost deliberate. No rush. No chaos. It struck me then that what we call wilderness often operates with more discipline than our systems allow. Its rules simply do not announce themselves. I wondered whether similar corrections had occurred elsewhere without notice. Not forests alone, but coastlines, plains, even urban margins. Places where infrastructure thins and intention weakens. Perhaps the northern forest was not exceptional, only patient enough to wait for overreach. The knowledge altered how I interpreted history. Disappearances once attributed to chance began to suggest restraint. Failed projects appeared less accidental. I stopped asking what had gone wrong and began asking what limit had been reached. The answers, when they came, were never explicit. They arrived as adjustments. I have never again felt compelled to assert control over a place. I enter landscapes as a visitor now, not a supervisor. This shift did not arise from fear alone. It arose from understanding that permission is not granted once, but continuously assessed. To assume otherwise is to invite correction. If this account troubles you, consider how often permission is assumed in your own surroundings. Ask whether absence of resistance implies acceptance. Ask what might observe quietly while we extend ourselves without pause. And ask, finally, whether correction always requires force, or whether silence has proven sufficient for far longer than we are willing to admit. After my retirement, I attempted to live as though the incident belonged to a concluded chapter, sealed by time and distance. Daily routines returned. Mornings were quiet. Evenings passed without interruption. Yet I became aware that certain signs no longer required explanation to be understood. They presented themselves without declaration, subtle but unmistakable, like marks left intentionally where they would eventually be noticed. The first appeared as an interruption of rhythm. Clocks in my home would stop briefly and resume without losing time. Not malfunction, but pause. It occurred infrequently, never long enough to be reported or repaired. Still, each pause carried the same sensation I had felt in the forest, a moment held deliberately, then released. I stopped checking the clocks. I already knew when it had happened. Sounds altered next. Footsteps in hallways where no one walked. Not imagined, not threatening. Simply present. They never approached my door. They stopped precisely where my hearing would strain to locate them. I realized then that distance itself was being measured again, not geographically, but personally. Whatever intelligence governed the pattern understood proximity in ways I did not. I began noticing interruptions in recorded information. Newspaper articles referencing infrastructure failures omitted expected details. Radio reports cut away from certain stories without explanation. These omissions were not coordinated. They were consistent. I recognized the language instantly. It was the same corrective restraint applied years earlier, now operating far from forests or rails. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, I found the private ledger I had once locked away. I had no memory of moving it. The pages were intact, but the final entries were missing. Torn cleanly, without damage to the binding. I did not search for them. I understood that some records are not destroyed to erase evidence, but to prevent synthesis. I experienced no fear in these moments, only acknowledgement. Fear had served its purpose earlier. Now, what remained was awareness. The intelligence I had encountered did not seek secrecy through intimidation. It allowed knowledge to persist in fragments, trusting that restraint would be self-maintained once understanding matured. I began to wonder how many individuals reach this stage independently. How many adapt quietly, never naming what they have recognized. The absence of shared language does not negate shared experience. It strengthens it. Silence becomes a common denominator rather than a barrier. On one occasion, I stood near a railway crossing long since decommissioned. No tracks remained, yet the ground retained its alignment. As I waited, a familiar pressure settled over the area. I did not look into the surrounding trees. I did not need to. I understood then that removal does not undo introduction. Some thresholds remain after the structure is gone. I no longer believe the entity required a forest, nor even land. It required interaction, repetition, and assertion. Wherever those converged without regard for permission, the pattern could emerge. The northern forest had merely been the first place I noticed it. Sleep brought no relief from this awareness, but it brought clarity. Dreams ceased their symbolism and became instructional once more. I no longer saw shapes. I saw intervals, distances, margins. I woke understanding which paths to avoid, which places to leave unmarked. There were moments when I considered that what I had encountered might not perceive us individually at all. It may observe systems, not people. Harris's disappearance then was not personal. It was proportional. That realization stripped the event of malice and replaced it with something colder, yet more precise. I have not been followed, pursued, or threatened. I have simply been included. Inclusion, I learned, does not imply acceptance. It implies recognition. The difference is subtle, but it carries weight that does not fade. If you are listening now, pay attention to interruptions that leave no trace. Notice pauses that feel intentional rather than accidental. Ask yourself what patterns repeat quietly across places that should have no connection. And ask whether some signs are never meant to warn, but only to confirm that observation continues. There is a difference between being observed and being noted. Observation can be passive, incidental, even indifferent. Being noted implies evaluation, placement within a framework not of one's choosing. I came to understand that distinction only after awareness had already settled in me. The cost was not immediate, nor dramatic. It manifested as a gradual narrowing of possibility, subtle but irreversible. Opportunities one might once have pursued simply failed to materialize. Invitations were delayed, then forgotten. Paths that appeared open diverted without obstruction. No resistance presented itself, only redirection. It was as though an unseen hand adjusted probability rather than circumstance. I did not feel targeted. I felt accounted for. I noticed this most clearly in travel. Routes I selected encountered unexpected closures. Vehicles failed without mechanical explanation shortly before departures. Weather intervened with improbable timing. None of these events alone would merit suspicion. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Movement itself seemed negotiated. I began to sense that my continued proximity to certain thresholds, even conceptual ones, carried consequence. Attention, once earned, does not dissipate simply because one grows quiet. It recalibrates. The intelligence I had encountered did not pursue me actively. It did not need to. It had already adjusted the margins within which I operated. This realization altered how I viewed free will. Not in absolute terms, but in degrees. Choice remained, but outcomes appeared gently weighted. I was free to act, but not without response. The response was never punitive. It was corrective, ensuring that trajectories did not converge again where they were no longer permitted. I found that resistance increased the pressure subtly. When I insisted on retracing old habits, the environment responded with delay and complication. When I yielded, when I accepted detours without challenge, equilibrium returned. This was not conditioning through fear. It was instruction through consequence. I do not believe this process was unique to me. I suspect many experience similar adjustments and attribute them to age, chance, or circumstance. The difference lies in recognition. Once you recognize the pattern, you stop misnaming it. You stop calling it coincidence. That cessation marks another threshold. There were days when I resented this quiet governance, this unspoken arbitration of movement and outcome. Yet resentment faded quickly. It requires energy, and energy invites notice. I learned instead to conserve attention, to remain within the margins that produced the least friction. Adaptation became second nature. I came to understand that the entity's intelligence did not resemble ours in ambition or emotion. It did not seek expansion, dominance, or even acknowledgement. It sought equilibrium. Once equilibrium was restored, intervention ceased. That economy of action suggested long refinement. Memory itself became selective. Certain details blurred without effort. Others remained sharply intact. I did not attempt to correct this imbalance. I trusted that what persisted did so for a reason. The rest was permitted to fade. Forgetting, I learned, can be a form of cooperation. I do not feel diminished by this understanding. I feel narrowed, perhaps, but also stabilized. There is relief in knowing which paths will not open again. Expectation adjusts accordingly. The world becomes quieter, more predictable, though no less heavy. If you sense that your own life has shifted without visible cause, consider whether you have been noted rather than merely observed. Ask whether redirection has replaced resistance in subtle ways. And ask yourself what equilibrium might require of those who once crossed thresholds without knowing they existed. There comes a stage when patterns no longer require interpretation. They announce themselves through repetition alone. By then, the mind no longer searches for causes, it registers alignment. I reached that stage slowly, without ceremony, and once there, I understood that the incident had moved beyond experience and into structure. I began to notice how often institutional language mirrors natural restraint. Words like deprioritized, deferred, and non-essential appeared with increasing frequency in contexts that once demanded urgency. These terms did not deny existence. They suspended relevance. The resemblance to the forest's behavior was unmistakable. Attention was withdrawn not to erase, but to neutralize. I revisited public records unrelated to railways, urban planning, water management, energy distribution. In each, I found instances where expansion halted just short of completion, not due to opposition, but due to hesitation. Projects paused indefinitely, never cancelled, never resumed. The spaces they left behind became margins, neither used nor reclaimed. Thresholds, waiting. What unsettled me was how these pauses accumulated. Not clustered, not dramatic, but evenly distributed across regions and decades. It suggested not a single point of intervention, but a principle applied wherever repetition exceeded allowance. The intelligence behind it did not adapt to us. We adapted to it, unconsciously, across generations. I realized then that the Northern Forest incident was not anomalous. It was exemplary. It demonstrated the pattern clearly enough to be noticed, but subtly enough to be dismissed. Most corrections do not require disappearance. They require only interruption. Harris's loss had been necessary because the threshold there had already been crossed too often. I found myself recalling conversations I had once dismissed, remarks made by older colleagues about routes that never behaved right or places where the schedule didn't hold. At the time, I attributed these to fatigue or superstition. Now I understood them as inherited awareness, passed down without vocabulary. The pattern did not oppose human presence outright. It opposed insistence. Temporary use was tolerated. Permanent assertion was corrected. This distinction explained much: why campsites endure while cities crumble, why footpaths remain while highways fracture. The intelligence observed not scale, but intent. I began to understand why fear had diminished over time. Fear is reactive. What remained now was comprehension. Comprehension carries weight without urgency. It does not compel action. It compels adjustment. The forest had not frightened me into submission. It had educated me into alignment. There were moments when I considered that this intelligence might not perceive itself as separate from environment at all. Perhaps what I had encountered was not an entity, but a function, an emergent correction embedded in certain conditions. Yet that thought never fully satisfied me. Functions do not demonstrate patience. They do not choose. Choice remained the most troubling aspect. Whatever governed the pattern chose when to act and when to refrain. It chose proportionality. It chose silence over display. These were not the qualities of instinct. They were the qualities of deliberation. I have often wondered whether our modern insistence on continuity, growth, and documentation accelerates the need for such correction. Each record we keep resists erasure. Each structure we maintain resists return. Perhaps the pattern exists to ensure that nothing remains indefinitely where it was never meant to stay. If patterns in your own life or surroundings feel deliberate rather than accidental, ask what thresholds may have been crossed quietly. Ask whether interruption is sometimes the only language restraint uses. And ask, finally, whether understanding arrives not to warn us, but to teach us how to remain where we are still permitted. I have come to understand that every account reaches a boundary beyond which testimony ceases to function as record and becomes participation. Until recently, I believed I was still documenting, still observing from a position of separation. That belief has eroded. The act of writing itself now feels weighted, as though it occupies space that must be acknowledged by whatever first acknowledged me. There are details I no longer attempt to recover. Certain memories resist recall not through absence, but through pressure. When I approach them, the same compression I once felt in the forest returns, subtle yet unmistakable. It is not prohibition. It is guidance, firm and impersonal, indicating where articulation should end. I recognize now that the intelligence I encountered never sought witnesses in the conventional sense. It required only recognition. Once recognition occurred, continuation followed naturally. Testimony was neither encouraged nor prevented. It was tolerated, up to a point. That tolerance, I suspect, has limits. I have noticed that when I reread earlier portions of this account, they feel increasingly distant, as though written by someone else. The events remain accurate, but the perspective has shifted. I am no longer at the center of the narrative. I am peripheral, included only insofar as I continue to align. This change has altered how I perceive responsibility. I once believed that survival carried an obligation to inform. Now I see that survival may itself be conditional upon restraint. Knowledge, when disseminated indiscriminately, does not liberate. It provokes. The distinction matters more than I once understood. There have been moments when I felt the impulse to destroy this account entirely, to remove the final traces of synthesis before they attract consequence. That impulse passes each time, replaced by a quieter understanding. Erasure would imply urgency. Urgency invites attention. Patience, I have learned, remains the safer posture. I am aware that by structuring these events into coherence, I may already be exceeding allowance. Patterns resist exposure not because they are fragile, but because exposure accelerates replication. Once named, a threshold invites crossing. Silence preserves ambiguity. Ambiguity preserves distance. I no longer attempt to determine whether the intelligence I encountered perceives this account. That question assumes a vantage I no longer claim. If it observes systems rather than individuals, then this testimony may be irrelevant. If it observes synthesis, then relevance has already been established. Either possibility suggests restraint is prudent. There are nights when I sense that the balance I achieved through adaptation is recalibrating again. Not through fear, not through threat, but through narrowing. Options simplify. Decisions reduce. This is not punishment. It is alignment adjusting as circumstances change. I have not returned to the northern forest, nor do I intend to. Return would imply unfinished business. I believe the exchange concluded as intended. Harris's absence, the spur's removal, my withdrawal, these were sufficient. Anything further would constitute insistence. I am nearing the point where continuation of this account offers diminishing clarity. What remains cannot be clarified without crossing into assertion. Assertion, I now understand, is the very mechanism that invites correction. The limit of testimony is not imposed externally. It is recognized internally. If you are still listening, consider why some accounts end not with revelation, but with restraint. Ask yourself whether understanding always requires completion. And ask whether the most accurate record of certain encounters is not what is written, but what is deliberately left unfinished. There are matters that do not conclude so much as they settle. They find a depth at which further movement becomes unnecessary. The Northern Forest incident has reached that depth within me. It no longer demands attention, yet it does not release it. What remains is not memory alone, but a sustained adjustment, an orientation shaped by encounter rather than explanation. I have come to accept that uncertainty was not a failure of observation, but its intended outcome. Whatever intelligence governed the incident did not require comprehension to function. It required recognition and response. The lack of certainty preserved proportion. To define it fully would have been to misrepresent it, forcing form where none was offered. There are questions I no longer ask. What it was. Where it came from. Whether it persists in the same manner now. These questions assume boundaries that were never confirmed. The incident suggested not origin or destination, but presence constrained by condition. That distinction matters more than taxonomy. I sometimes wonder whether Harris understood more in his final moments than we did. Not through revelation, but through alignment. Perhaps he crossed a threshold that the rest of us sensed but did not reach. If so, his disappearance was not random. It was precise. Precision, I have learned, is never accidental. The forest itself has likely changed since then. Trees fall. Growth returns. Snow covers old impressions. Yet I doubt the conditions that permitted the incident have vanished entirely. Conditions persist longer than structures. They wait until repetition reconstitutes opportunity. I have encountered others, rarely, who speak in similar terms without coordination. A pause before a sentence. A refusal to elaborate. A shared understanding that explanation would diminish rather than clarify. These encounters are brief. They do not seek continuation. Recognition is sufficient. I no longer feel compelled to assign blame, either to the system that enabled the incident or to the intelligence that responded to it. Blame implies moral framing. What occurred operated outside that structure. It corrected imbalance without judgment. That impartiality is what unsettles most. The longer I live with this understanding, the more I suspect that such incidents are not aberrations, but corrections woven quietly into the broader narrative we choose not to examine. We remember disasters because they rupture continuity. We forget adjustments because they preserve it. If this account has reached you intact, then it has done so because it did not violate the conditions that govern attention. It does not instruct action. It does not invite pursuit. It offers only alignment through awareness. That, I believe, remains permissible. I will not add to this record beyond what has already been stated. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because what remains resists articulation without distortion. Some truths persist best when approached indirectly, through consequence rather than declaration. The Northern Forest incident did not end when the spur was removed or when I left my post. It ended when insistence ceased. What continues now is quieter, less visible, but no less present for those who have learned how to recognize it. If you take anything from this testimony, let it be restraint rather than certainty. Ask not what was encountered, but what conditions made encounter possible. Ask where similar conditions might exist unnoticed. And ask whether some things endure not because they are hidden, but because we have learned, collectively, when not to look. With time, I noticed that even unresolved matters undergo a final adjustment. Not resolution, but stabilization. The Northern Forest incident no longer intrudes upon my thoughts uninvited. Instead, it occupies a fixed position, like a landmark known well enough to avoid without conscious effort. This is not forgetting. It is accommodation. I have ceased dreaming of rails and forests. That absence is not relief. It is confirmation that instruction has concluded. The mind no longer rehearses what it has already integrated. Fear, once sharp, then heavy, has thinned into something quieter and more enduring. Vigilance without urgency. Awareness without fixation. I am aware now that my role was never to uncover, expose, or warn. It was to observe long enough to understand when observation itself must end. That distinction defines the boundary between witness and participant. I crossed it gradually, without realizing the moment of transition, and I suspect that was intentional. The intelligence that governed the incident did not depart. It did not need to. Its influence persists not through presence, but through calibration. Systems adjust. Behaviors shift. Expansion hesitates. These changes are attributed to economics, politics, or fatigue. Rarely are they recognized as correction. That anonymity is its greatest protection. There are times when I feel the narrowing of possibility one final degree, as though margins are being gently refined. This does not frighten me. It reassures me that alignment remains active. That I have not strayed beyond what is tolerated. The absence of intervention signals success. I have considered whether the intelligence might one day withdraw entirely, its task complete. I find that thought unlikely. Correction implies recurrence. As long as insistence returns, so will response. Permanence, I have learned, is never granted outright. It is leased, reviewed, and occasionally revoked. I think often of Harris, not as a victim, but as a measure. His disappearance established proportion without escalation. It demonstrated the cost of crossing a threshold already exceeded. That cost has never been repeated in my awareness, which suggests it achieved its purpose. Balance restored does not require reinforcement. The forest where this began may no longer resemble itself. Roads may pass nearby again. New structures may rise. If they do, I suspect the same patience will greet them. Nothing will occur immediately. That is the most important detail to remember. Correction does not rush. I have outlived my professional relevance. My authority exists now only in memory. That suits the logic I encountered. Authority invites assertion. Obsolescence invites quiet. In quiet, one remains less visible, and visibility, I have learned, carries consequence. This account has grown longer than I intended. Length itself risks synthesis. I feel the approach of the boundary once more, firm but not forceful. The same pressure I felt in the forest now rests upon this narrative. It signals that continuation would no longer be observational. There is nothing further I can add without shifting the balance this testimony has maintained. I have no desire to test that balance. The incident taught me the value of ending where alignment still holds. That lesson remains intact. If you are still listening, consider whether endings are chosen or permitted. Ask whether the absence of conclusion is itself a form of resolution. And ask, finally, whether what corrected us once still watches not with intent, but with patience, waiting to see if we remember when to stop. I had believed that there would be a moment when this account would simply stop, when the act of writing would lose momentum and settle naturally into silence. Instead, what arrived was a pressure familiar enough to recognize, yet different in its intent. It did not urge continuation. It demanded completion. Not explanation, not summary, but a final alignment of language with what had already been understood without words. This realization came without fear. Fear had long since fulfilled its function. What replaced it was a sense of precision, the same quality I had once observed in the forest. The intelligence that governed that place valued proportion, timing, and restraint. An ending, I now see, is not the absence of continuation, but the correct placement of cessation. I reviewed the entirety of what I had written, not to revise, but to ensure that nothing exceeded allowance. The account remained intact because it did not insist. It described consequence without attribution, presence without definition. It resisted the impulse to name. That resistance, I believe, is why it has persisted this far. There are no further events to record. Nothing followed my retirement that would qualify as incident. That absence is not reassuring. It is consistent. The pattern does not repeat unnecessarily. Once correction achieves balance, repetition would imply error. I have seen no error. I have come to accept that what occurred in the northern forest was not meant to be solved, contained, or archived. It was meant to be absorbed and then allowed to dissolve into behavior rather than memory. I am not haunted by it. I am shaped by it. The difference is essential. I no longer measure my life in years or milestones, but in margins respected and paths avoided. This adjustment does not feel imposed. It feels earned, the result of having remained attentive long enough to recognize when attention must withdraw. Many never reach that point. I did, by proximity and consequence. I suspect that this testimony will be read by some who sense familiarity without recognition. That is as it should be. Recognition does not always announce itself consciously. Often it manifests as discomfort, as hesitation, as the urge to stop reading before understanding why. That urge is not accidental. If you have reached this point without interruption, consider what allowed you to do so. Ask whether curiosity outweighed restraint, or whether restraint guided curiosity without your awareness. The difference matters more than content. I will not speculate further on what observed us, corrected us, or permitted us to remain. Speculation would imply distance, and distance is no longer a position I claim. I speak only to what consequence taught me, and consequence does not elaborate. This record ends here not because there is nothing more, but because there is nothing more that can be said without transforming acknowledgement into assertion. Assertion invites correction. Correction, once delivered, does not repeat itself for emphasis. I have written what was permitted to remain written. I have left unsaid what demanded to remain unformed. Between those two constraints lies the only accuracy available to me now. Anything beyond that would be excess. And if you are asking yourself whether the Northern Forest incident was about a place, a presence, or an intelligence, ask instead why a railroad station master learned that the most important signal is the one that never turns green, and why something patient enough to wait decades would allow you to read this only after it was certain you could not go there to look. I am aware that every conclusion risks misinterpretation. To conclude is to imply certainty, and certainty was never offered to me. What I leave here is not an answer, but a boundary. Beyond it, language no longer serves observation, only assertion. I will not cross that line again. This account was never intended to survive intact. It endured because it resisted emphasis. It moved carefully, as I learned to move, without demanding belief or provoking inquiry. If it has reached you, then it has done so quietly, without insistence, and that alone should suggest its nature. I do not ask that you accept what I have described. Acceptance is irrelevant. What matters is recognition, of pattern, of restraint, of the way certain events dissolve without explanation while others echo endlessly. Ask yourself which kind of events history preserves, and which it quietly releases. There are places you have passed without noticing their refusal. Places where sound compresses, where movement slows, where decisions feel heavier than they should. You may have attributed this to fatigue, weather, or mood. That attribution is convenient. It allows continuity. I once believed that infrastructure marked progress, that permanence was proof of success. I no longer hold that belief. Permanence invites evaluation. Evaluation invites correction. The longest-lasting things are often those that remain provisional, never insisting on their right to remain. If the Northern Forest incident has any meaning beyond itself, it lies not in what was encountered, but in how quickly the world adjusted to its absence. Tracks removed. Records amended. Silence normalized. No vacuum remained. That efficiency should concern you more than the disappearance itself. You may wonder whether such corrections still occur. Whether something patient continues to observe margins and thresholds. I will not answer that. Answers create orientation, and orientation invites return. Some understandings are safer when left without coordinates. What I will say is this: fear was never the objective. Fear fades. Awareness endures. The weight you may feel now, reading this, is not dread. It is proximity to a limit you were not previously aware of. That sensation does not demand action. It demands restraint. I have lived long enough to see how often humanity mistakes silence for emptiness. How frequently we fill gaps simply because they exist. Consider the possibility that some gaps persist not because they have been overlooked, but because they are doing exactly what they are meant to do. If you carry this account with you after it ends, carry it lightly. Do not seek the forest. Do not seek confirmation. Seek instead the moments when something within you hesitates without explanation, and respect that hesitation without naming it. This testimony does not ask to be shared, debated, or proven. It exists as residue, no more and no less. Residue does not point backward. It alters what passes through it afterward. And when you reach a place where progress slows, sound diminishes, and the path ahead feels politely unavailable, remember that not every closed route is blocked, some are simply no longer permitted, and the most intelligent response is to turn away without ever needing to know why.